What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Cricut Debut Smart and the Cricut Debut. Now, I know what you might be thinking, and I'm kind of thinking the same thing. Are these really just the same phone? Because despite some obvious design differences, when it comes to the specs, in I want to say most areas, they're almost completely identical. But I'm going to be going through the similarities and differences between the two phones to give you a better idea of which one is right for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. And just so you know, if you do want to see the latest Cricut deals, those are in the description as well. But with that being said, let's get this started. So with the Cricut Debut Smart, we're getting a 5.5-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 295, and an 18:9 aspect ratio. With the regular Cricut Debut, we're getting a 5.5-inch LCD display as well, with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 255, and an aspect ratio of 19.5:9. So between the two, they're pretty much the exact same. I guess the original Cricut Debut does have a slightly better aspect ratio of 19.5:9 versus 18:9, giving it a taller and more narrow form factor, but honestly they look exactly the same, and I might be wrong about that. So I checked and I actually was wrong. The Cricut Debut does have an aspect ratio of 18:9. So just like the Cricut Debut Smart, they actually are completely the same as far as the display goes. So in general, while they don't really look bad for what they are, I mean, they are 720p LCD displays, which is definitely pretty basic. So considering that, the images do look pretty decent, but the viewing angles, as you can see, are really not the best. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, these phones are not going to be the easiest to see. And of course, the most obvious thing here is that 5.5 inches. These are really not very large phones. So if you're consuming a lot of content, whether you're watching videos, playing games, or even just doing something like browsing the web or reading, in general, if you're just going to be on your phone a lot, these are probably not going to be the most comfortable for you. But that being said, for more basic activities, I do think these phones are going to be at least acceptable. And looking at it this way, pretty much every smartphone nowadays is at least 6 inches, if not larger. And while that is good for most people, some people might want a more compact device. And if you are one of those people, a phone like the Cricut Debut Smart or the Cricut Debut at only 5.5 inches is definitely going to be a much better option. Now, both of these phones are getting 32 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion. So in general, no matter what you're doing on your phone, unless you're really doing hardly anything at all, I really don't think this is enough for anyone. I mean, the system itself takes up a decent amount of space already. And when you add stuff like apps, photos, and videos and things like that that are getting larger and larger as time goes on, if you are using your phone a lot, 32 gigabytes is going to fill up pretty quickly. Now, to be fair, these phones do have microSD card expansion, so you can at least offload stuff like photos and videos. But still, if you are more of a heavy user and you're installing lots of apps and games and stuff like that, then you're probably going to want to go for a higher end device that has more storage. Now, for security features, unfortunately, neither of these phones have fingerprint scanners, but at least with the Cricut Debut Smart, we do get Face Unlock, whereas the Cricut Debut doesn't have Face Unlock either. So in general, this is a little disappointing because honestly, even the lowest end phones usually have fingerprint scanners. But again, at least with the Cricut Debut Smart, we do get Face Unlock, so we have another option besides a PIN or a password to unlock it. But with the Cricut Debut, unfortunately, you will have to use a PIN or a password. Now, taking a look at the camera setups here, these phones honestly have equally featureless cameras, both of them having 5 megapixel front-facing cameras. Then on the back with the Cricut Debut Smart, we got a single 5 megapixel rear camera. And with the original Cricut Debut, we got pretty much the same thing, and this camera is 8 megapixels. Now in general, despite this really slight difference, you're really not going to see a significant difference in photo quality between the two. And honestly, in addition to really having pretty much no features at all, these cameras also don't really take very good photos. So if you're taking photos for social media, for example, you're definitely going to want something with a better camera. But if you're doing something like maybe scanning barcodes or just using Snapchat where the quality doesn't really matter, then either of these phones will at least get the job done. For video, both phones have a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, and while just like the photo quality, the video quality is really not going to be usable for hardly anything, since these phones can record in 1080p if again you're just using something like Snapchat. With these phones, the videos are at least going to look decent. Now as far as RAM and processor go, with the Cricut Debut Smart, we're getting 3 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A22 processor. With the regular Cricut Debut, we're getting 2 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A20. As far as the overall performance goes, I have noticed these phones to be pretty much about the same. You're not really going to see a significant difference, but I guess technically, the Cricut Debut Smart does have a slightly better processor, so there is that. Now I did run Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and here are the scores I got. So as you can see from this test, the Cricut Debut Smart is technically a little bit faster, but keep in mind, this difference is really not that visible, and these phones are really going to be at the same level. So in general, if you're going to be on your phone a lot, doing stuff like web browsing, social media, things like that, these are not going to be the best phones for you because they are pretty slow. So again, if you are more of a heavy user, or even a moderate user for that matter, you're probably going to want to get a faster phone, but if you're a really light user and you're just using your phone for the absolute minimum, doing things like sending text messages, making calls, and maybe some really light occasional web browsing, in that kind of situation, either of these phones will at least get the job done. Now, both of these phones have 2500 mAh batteries, so the battery life is definitely not very impressive here. So if you are in a situation where you're not always around a charger and you need a phone that's really going to last throughout the day, then neither of these phones is really going to be it. But if you are in that kind of situation, keep in mind, both of these phones do have removable batteries. So worst case scenario, I guess you could technically get extra batteries and just replace them as the phones die. And that can be good for battery longevity too. But in general, aside from that, honestly, that seems like a lot more trouble than it's actually worth. So at the end of the day, if you are looking for a phone with a really good battery, then I would definitely get something else. Now, in some of my past videos, some people have actually asked me how to take the battery out. And now that I think of it, I guess it can be a little bit confusing. So let me demonstrate. And keep in mind with both of these phones, as well as pretty much any other phone that has a removable battery, it's going to be pretty much the exact same. So with any phone that has a removable battery, there's going to be a little tab right here. You're going to want to pull on this. So like that. Now pop the back off. And there we go. So as you can see, the battery is right here, as well as the slot for the SIM card and the microSD card. And when you're done with this, you can snap it right back into place. And that's pretty much it. And again, in my experience, every phone with a removable battery has pretty much the exact same design. So with the regular Cricket Debut, again, it's right here. Pop the tab like this. There you go. And you can put it right back on. Just to give you an idea of how consistent this is, I have the BlueView 3 here, another completely unrelated phone that's not even from Cricket. And again, to take out the battery, pull this little tab right here. There we go. And again, same thing. So in case you were wondering, if you do happen to have a phone with a removable battery, or you end up getting one of these phones, and you want to know how to take it out, that's pretty much how you do it. But at the end of the day, I'm not really a huge fan of this design, but I do see why some people might prefer it. But again, honestly, if battery life is really a concern for you, then I would definitely just go for a higher end phone that has a better battery. Now, another difference between these two phones is that with the Cricket Debut, this phone has Android 11, whereas the Cricket Debut Smart has Android 12. And seeing that these are both really low-end Cricket branded phones, I'm 99.9% sure neither of them are getting any major updates. So on one hand, while if you want the newest version of Android, you're obviously not going to be happy with either of these phones. If you don't really care about having Android 13 or any major updates, and you just want something decently newer, then the Cricket Debut Smart will be a slightly better choice. Another thing to keep in mind here is that neither of these phones have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using Tap and Pay, unfortunately you won't be able to do that with either of these phones. But then again, that's probably not very surprising, seeing that these phones are both under $100, and in this day and age, even though we are starting to see NFC in more and more phones, I feel like it's going to be a while before it makes it down to this level. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, in almost every way, these phones are pretty much the exact same. In fact, it was at the point where before I did this video, I didn't even think they were going to be different at all. But that being said, in every way where there's a significant difference, the Cricket Debut Smart is a slightly better device. And honestly, this is really just for the software, because this phone again does have Android 12, whereas the Cricket Debut has Android 11 and not even regular Android 11, but it has the Go edition, which is basically just a smaller version. Not that that really matters or anything, but again, the Cricket Debut Smart does in fact have a better software, and again, it does have Face Unlock too. But other than that, aside from I guess the regular Cricket Debut having an 8 megapixel camera versus a 5 megapixel camera on the Cricket Debut Smart, honestly in practice, this is really not going to make a huge difference, because in reality, aside from stuff like using Snapchat or scanning barcodes, neither camera is really going to be very good anyway. But again, in general, if you want a really cheap entry-level phone for really basic activities, then between the two, although the Cricket Debut will work in that situation, I do think the Cricket Debut Smart will be a better choice. And another thing that just occurred to me, if you happen to have the Cricket Debut and you're considering upgrading to the Cricket Debut Smart, honestly I wouldn't recommend it, because aside from those two differences, these phones are pretty much the same. But this concludes my comparison between the Cricket Debut Smart and the Cricket Debut. Again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.